Doing 1-6B. Zephyr doesn't want to write. Oh, did we get an update? We did. That's fancy. So 1-6B is dividing real numbers. Okay, 1-6B. The beauty of today's lesson is it's a lot like yesterday's. 1-6A was multiplying real numbers. Now we're dividing real numbers. So the rules for division and multiplication are the same. Just like when you do PEMDAS, right? You multiply and divide in the same step. The rules that go along with that for multiplying and dividing with real numbers end up being the same. So I'm going to give you these two rules, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how zeros work because that is slightly different. What's a quotient? When you divide, it's the answer you get, right? So the first rule says the quotient of two numbers, two real numbers, but we're just going to say two numbers. The quotient of two numbers with the same sign. What do I mean by that? Positive or negative. So they're both positive or they're both negative, okay? So two numbers with the same sign is what? He did it yesterday. If we multiplied two numbers with the same sign, it was positive. If we divide two numbers with the same sign, it's positive. Okay? So if they have the same sign and you divide them, it will be a positive answer. So that means a negative divided by a negative or a positive divided by a positive, all of those will have a positive answer. Okay? Likewise to yesterday, the quotient of two numbers with different signs so two numbers with different signs, meaning one is positive and one is negative, or one is negative and one is positive, right? Quotient of two numbers with different signs is always going to be negative. You guys are so smart. So negative when they have different signs, positive when they have the same sign, okay? So what that means is if I have -6 divided by a -2, okay? Is my answer going to be positive or negative? Positive, right? Because it's two with the same sign will be positive, so my answer would be a +3. If I did 6 divided by 2, is my answer going to be positive or negative? Positive, right? Because they have the same, no, because they have the same sign. 6 divided by 2, right? They're both positive numbers. Yes?
Would we ever do, like, since it's -6 divided by...
Okay.
I figured it out.
Okay. All right, how about this then? If I did -6 divided by 2, what would I get? Positive or negative? A negative, because you have one of each. It would be -3. Okay, so that's this one. What if I did 6 divided by -2?
That would be positive, a
-3, right? Because you have a negative and you have a positive. So when you have one of each, it's going to be negative. When they are the same, it's going to be positive. Okay? Questions on that? It doesn't, like, so the negative can be over here or the negative can be here. If it's one positive and one negative, answer will be negative. Okay? Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about the number 0 and how 0 comes into play with division. Two things. Okay? When you take 0 divided by a number, so like 0 divided by 8, versus if I take a number divided by 0. Okay, another way you could write this is 0 divided by 8 versus 8 divided by 0. Okay, if I do 0 divided by a number. So these ones here. Does anyone know what you would get? 0, okay? 0 divided by a number is always 0. So this would be 0, this would be 0. And I will explain to you why in just a minute. Do you know what happens when you do a number divided by 0?
It's just a number.
It's what?
It just stays the same.
It doesn't stay the same. There's actually, it's not 0. There is no number associated with. We say this is undefined. Okay, these would both be undefined. You cannot divide by 0. Okay, so if you're dividing by 0, it's undefined. If it's 0 divided by something, it's 0. Here's how I want you to think of it, and maybe you need to write this down to help you remember it. That's fine. Think of it this way, okay? For this setup, if I said we had 0 apples divided among 8 kids. Okay? If I have 0 apples divided among 8 kids, how many apples does each kid get?
0.
0, right? So 0 divided by 8 is 0. Kids just get 0 apples. There are 8 kids, they get 0 apples. Okay? But if I said you have 8 apples among 0 kids. Okay, well, if there are no kids to divide the apples into, there's no way to divide those apples, right? So 8 apples among 0 kids is undefined. You can't do it. But you could take 0 apples and split that up among 8 kids. They would all get 0 apples, okay? So just keep that in mind as you think through it. Or just remember, you can't have a 0 on the denominator, right? You can't have a 0 on bottom. That is undefined. If you have a 0 on top, it's 0. If you have a 0 on bottom, it's undefined, okay? Any questions on that? All right, then we are going to do a few problems here. So this is like example 3 because we're just continuing this lesson from yesterday, 1-6b. What would negative 16 divided by 2 be? Positive or negative, first of all? Negative, because you have 1. And 16 divided by 2 is 8, so you would get negative 8. Okay? What about 24 divided by negative 3?
Negative 6. No.
Positive 6.
Negative, right? Because listen, you have one of each. You have a positive and you have a negative. When you have one of each, your answer is going to be negative.
8.
And 24 divided by 3 is 8. So that's a negative 8 also. Okay? What about this one? If I do negative 60 divided by negative 15. Positive or negative answer? Positive, because it's negative divided by negative, okay? That's always going to be positive. So 60 divided by 15 is 4. So your answer would be a positive 4, okay? How about this one? If I do 7 divided by 0.
That's undefined.
Undefined. Good. You cannot divide by 0, right? So that's going to be undefined. Okay. How about this one? Negative 90 divided by 10.
That would be negative 9.
Negative 9, right? It's going to be negative because you have one negative, one positive, and then when you divide that, you would get negative 9. Okay? How about this one? What's 0 divided by 9?
0.
0, right? 0 divided by anything will be 0. Okay? Questions on that? Okay. Then the only other thing that we're doing with, well, yes and no, I guess. I have one last little detail at the end. But the other like main concept, the one you're gonna see a lot throughout your math career, is dividing fractions. And you briefly saw this on that very first worksheet, and I gave you a fun little saying to go with it. So I'm gonna give you that saying again. And this is it. It says, when dividing fractions, and I'm going to switch it up a little bit because I don't like the way it was before. When dividing fractions, don't be shy. Flip the second guy. Anyone remember?
And simplify.
And multiply. Those were both great options, though. Okay, so when dividing fractions, don't be shy. Flip the second guy and multiply. Okay, that's what you need to remember when you're dividing fractions. Okay? Dustin, quit tapping. Okay, so we are going to do a few of dividing fraction problems. So let's start with this one. If I say 2/3 times a negative 5, sorry, not times, divided by, I was moving on, my bad. 2/3 divided by a negative 5/6. Okay, now think about what it says. When dividing fractions, which is what we're doing, don't be shy, flip the second guy and multiply instead. You are just full of it today, huh? It's a good day. Yes.
And you still keep the sign?
You keep the sign, the negative or positive, whatever is with it, you'll keep that.
Equals 4
Yes.
over 5.
Okay, so, well, here's what you do. So you take the 2/3 and that stays the same. We're going to multiply instead of dividing, and then we're going to flip it over. And now here's where I think a lot of the confusion lies. It's a negative 5/6. You guys with me? Yeah? Okay. A negative 5/6 flipped over. It doesn't matter where you put the negative. It just matters that there is a negative. I typically just leave the negative in the numerator all the time. But you don't have to, okay? But if it's a negative 5/6, I would call it a negative 6/5. Okay? Just make sure you don't put the negative with both numbers. It only belongs to one. It does not really matter which one. Okay? So if this is my setup and I need to multiply now, just out of curiosity, you can either multiply across and then reduce, or you can cross cancel and then multiply across. Do any of you know if you have a preference?
I multiply across, then I reduce.
You multiply across and then reduce?
Yeah.
Yes, all of you do that?
Yeah.
Okay, my class last year liked it the other way, but we will do that. Okay, so if we multiply across right now, you're going to do 2 times negative 6 is a negative 12. And then 3 times 5 is 15. And then you can reduce that fraction by dividing by what?
3.
3. So if I divide by 3 on both of these, so divide by 3 here, divide by 3 here, negative 12 divided by 3 is what?
4 over 5.
Negative 4, right? Because it's a negative 12 and a positive 3. 15 divided by 3 is 5. So your answer is a negative 4/5. Okay? All right, what would you do with this one? You have 20 divided by 1/4. Okay? When dividing fractions, don't ask why. Flip, or don't be shy. I'm going to say don't ask why every time because that's how I used to do it. Don't be shy. Flip the second guy and multiply. So how do I do that one? Here.
So then you flip the 4 over 1. So it's 4 over 1.
And then you make 20,
Then it's
20
80.
over 1.
So it's 80 over
Make
1.
it 20 over 1.
Okay, you can make it 20 over 1. What is my next thing I'm going to write down right here?
You're gonna do
Multiply.
4 over 1.
Multiplication, right? We're multiplying, and then we're flipping. So 1/4 becomes
4 over 1.
4 over 1. Now, technically, you don't even have to put the 1 there because 4 over 1 is 4, right? So you could just do 20 times 4,
Which equals 80.
and that would be 80, and you would be done then.
It equals 80.
Okay? If you find it simpler to put ones underneath both of them, that's fine too. But don't write your answer as 80 over 1. We always want the most simplified answer, which would just be 80. Okay? Do some what? On the board? I can give you some in a little bit. Okay, last big concept here is when dividing fractions, sometimes they're going to give it to you like this. They're going to say do x divided by y for x equals 3/8 and y equals 3/4. Okay, so technically if we were going to set it up like this, we would say it's for x we're going to plug in 3/8, so 3/8. And then we do our division bar, so that's this, and then our y is 3/4. Now, I don't ever need to see it like that from you if you want to just write it the way we've been writing it, which I feel like makes more sense to people, okay? Essentially what we're saying is 3/8 divided by 3/4, okay? If I were you, I would just start with that. I would not even go here. But if you want to, if it helps you to see it that way, that's fine. So what do I do to solve this? Same thing as our last two. Multiply and flip it. So you're going to do 3/8 times, flip it over, you get 4/3. Okay? Now if we multiply across, 3 times 4 is 12. 8 times 3 is 24. What does 12 over 24 reduce to? 1/2. Okay, so your answer would be 1/2. Does that make sense? Okay, we're going to do one more in that format, and then we'll call it good. So x divided by y for these numbers. X is negative 3/4. Y is negative 2/3. Okay? And like I said, you don't have to set it up in that format. It's just showing you that you're dividing. Okay? So we're going to say x, negative 3/4. Dustin, will you please stop tapping? And we're going to divide by negative 2/3. Okay? So when we set that problem up again, it's going to be negative 3/4. What comes next? Multiplication, so times, and then what do? Negative 3 over 2. You're going to flip it. Okay, keep your sign, negative 3 over 2. So now we can just multiply across. What do we get on top?
You get
Negative
positive
9.
6.
Positive.
Dang, I think
Combine those, right? Negative 3 times negative 3 is a positive 9. What's 4 times 2?
8.
So your answer is 9/8. Okay. So for these problems, we've been taking a reciprocal, right? We've been flipping things over. You're going to also see in the future something called the opposite reciprocal. So I just want to make sure you get what this is. An opposite reciprocal. Opposite means positive to negative or negative to positive. Reciprocal means you're going to flip your A over B becomes B over A, right? So can you tell me what the opposite reciprocal of 2/3 would be?
3 over 2.
The opposite reciprocal. Negative 3 over 2. Okay, that'd be an opposite reciprocal. What would the opposite reciprocal of 8 be?
Negative 8.
But you want the reciprocal. What is 8 as a fraction?
8
8 over 1.
Essentially, this is like 8 over 1. So when we flip it over,
Negative 8.
it's a negative 1 over 8.
Oh,
Okay?
this one.
What would the opposite reciprocal of negative 7/2 be?
Positive 2 over 7.
Positive 2 over 7. Okay? So when dividing fractions, we don't change the sign, but eventually we'll get into a place where we'll do the opposite reciprocal and we will change the sign. Just don't mix that up, okay? Opposite reciprocal means change the sign and flip it. Reciprocal means you just flip it over, which is what you'll do with dividing, okay? Questions on that? All right.